The Pest and Predator Podcast is brought to you by Field Heroes, powered by the Western Grains Research Foundation. Visit fieldheroes.ca to learn how beneficial insects can benefit your farm. Welcome to the Pest and Predator Podcast. I'm your host, Shaun Haney, founder of RealAgriculture.com. Looking forward to Season 4 of the Pests and Predators Podcast. It is brought to you by Field Heroes, powered by the Western Grains Research Foundation. Visit fieldheroes.ca to learn how beneficial insects can benefit your farm. Today's guest in the Pest and Predator Podcast is Dr. Tyler Wist. He's a research scientist with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, based out of Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. Dr. Wist, great to chat with you again on the Pest and Predator Podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me here.
Okay, so today's title is Lurkers in the Lentils and Friends in the Faba, Predation of Pea Aphids by Beetles and Flies. I love our discussions on this kind of topic. So I guess what sort of problems can pea aphids cause for a farmer in their crop?
All right, well, that's a great question. So I've been looking at pea aphids for a little while now. And what we realized was there's only a nominal economic threshold for pea aphids in lentils. So that's anyone's best guess. Is it happening? Is it not happening? What level should I control these pea aphids at? And then in faba bean, we didn't have any idea what level we needed to control these pea aphids at. And so looking at those things, and also just field peas themselves, like the economic threshold was developed in the 1980s on a variety called Century that no one grows anymore. So do those things still hold? So we started looking at these economic thresholds to answer these questions about pea aphids. But, you know, as we're doing this, we're out there with our sweep nets. We're catching some other things in there as well. And we're catching these beneficial insects. So I called it Lurkers in the Lentils because it's actually really hard to see pea aphids in lentils. You can get down there and have a look and you're like, can't even see any pea aphids till you start shaking the plants, or you get your sweep net down into the plants, and you're like, oh, we do have some pea aphids lurking in the lentils. And so we were finding this beneficial insect complex, and it changes every year. So sometimes you get nothing but lady beetles in there. So there's those beetles, those are your friends in the favas, also your friends in the lentils. And both those adult lady beetles and the larval lady beetles. And maybe you don't know what a larval lady beetle looks like. I encourage you to look it up. I've heard them described as little alligators before. Those guys are in there and they're eating those pea aphids like popcorn. It's great. And then, so when I first started out, we were looking in a cereal aphid system. And so we were sweeping the cereal aphids out of the heads and having a look at the natural enemy complex that was in there. And we didn't see a whole lot of fly activity. And you're like, what? Flies? I never really heard of flies being predatory or parasitic before. But yeah, there are a few flies that are both predatory and parasitic. So threw flies into the mix because this year we really started seeing a lot of these hoverfly larvae. And so we even saw it in the cereal complexes too. So when your cereals get aphids, you can find these slug-like looking things, and we were finding them in our sweep net samples, in the lentils and the fava bean, and also in the cereal crop. And we're like, whoa, look at these things. And to the untrained observer, you're like, what? I have slugs in my field now? But no, what we had there were the larvae of these hoverflies. So very cool little insects, and beneficial both at the stage of being aphid eaters when they're larvae, but the adults are out there pollinating as well. So, faba bean requires cross-pollination. So they could be doing some cross-pollination in the favas, and lentil flowers as well. So they could be helping out lentil crops with cross-pollination too.
Very cool. And so, pea aphid's definitely the villain of this story.
Always the villain.
Always the villain. I like it. There's no questioning it. Okay. So what do pea aphids look like? And talk a little bit about their biology.
All right. So let's say pea aphid, because it's an insect, it's got 6 legs. But sometimes it has wings and sometimes it doesn't have wings. So under strong population pressure, or if the plants are starting to senesce, a lot of those adults will get wings and they'll pick up and they'll leave. So I was looking at some of my data right before I sprayed the in an experimental trial. My aphid population just dropped, and I went, "What?" So it looks like I sprayed before I actually sprayed, and wasn't the case. So when we looked at the data in detail, we found that like the day before the aphid population dropped, most of the adults got wings and they picked up and flew away. So when you're looking at a pea aphid, they're typically green. Sometimes they come in red. We also find that in the English grain aphids in the cereals too. Sometimes they come in red, and then that can really confuse people. But they've got long antennae like typical insects. They've got two siphuncuли on the back. Sometimes we call them butt snorkels. In colloquial terms, they don't actually breathe through them, but they use them to release an alarm pheromone. And so when they get preyed upon by something like a hoverfly larva or a lady beetle, they'll release this alarm pheromone, and it basically tells their sisters, because these things are all females, they're all born pregnant, and yeah, they lay live, instead of laying eggs, they lay live offspring who start feeding right away. So your pea aphid populations can increase exponentially if there's nothing acting on them. So they get attacked by these natural enemies, they release this alarm pheromone, and then the other ones should react to it, leave the area, so they're not next on the menu.
So let's talk about, we covered the villain. Now let's talk about the hero here, and the hero of the story. What's out there to eat these pea aphids?
Right. So I've mentioned lady beetles before, but we also get these beetles coming in. They're called soft-winged flower beetles. And so the literature suggests that they eat around 12 aphids a day, which isn't huge. Like your typical lady beetle, large lady beetle adult will eat around 70 or 80 aphids per day. So, they've got a good appetite. They're good consumers. But the soft-winged flower beetles, we're finding them in the sweep nets, and they're a red-black color. Sorry, a red and blue color, not red and black. It's the lady beetles. So these soft-winged flower beetles are in there, and we don't really know if they're having a huge impact or not. So we've been doing things like trying to figure out how many aphids they'll eat in a day. Data yet to come. But these guys are really interesting. And so we've got a pest that attacks cereal crops called the cereal leaf beetle, and it's also a beetle that is red and blue. So sometimes you can confuse those. So just here to tell you that, if you're finding these things running around with aphids, it's probably actually eating the aphids, and it's not a cereal leaf beetle, especially if you're in a pulse crop.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit more about the biology of beetles?
Yeah. So the beetles will come into a crop. Let's talk about lady beetles. Lady beetles will come into a crop and they'll make an assessment. They'll say, I'm going to eat a few things around here. Is there enough for my offspring to survive? When they make that decision, then they'll lay eggs. So if you've got a crop and you've got larval lady beetles in there, then you can say, yeah, I think I must have some aphids. So I better go looking for aphids, see if I'm anywhere near that economic threshold, because that adult lady beetle has made that decision that your crop has enough food source to support its offspring.
So Tyler, what kind of flies will eat pea aphids?
Yeah, so we're mentioning these hoverflies. So you're looking at a crop and you're like, what are these things flying around? Looks like wasps, because they've got that red-black coloration. They want you to think that they're wasps and that they've got a stingy business end that they might be able to hurt you with, but they don't. They're just flies. So if you were to have a really close look at them, you'd find that they've got really only 2 wings, and their second pair of wings are modified into these tiny little haltier things. Whereas if they were a wasp, they would have 4 full wings. They've also got really weird little antennae that don't look like a wasp antennae, and often really kind of big bulbous fly eyes. So these come in and they're pollinating, but then they're also assessing the crop. Are there any aphids here? should I lay some eggs for my offspring? And then you get these slug-like offspring that you see going after the pea aphids. And you'll catch them in the sweep net, but if you keep an eye on them, you'll see them. They've got kind of a pointy head area. They don't have any legs because they're fly larvae, which is why they kind of look slug-like. They're kind of a greenish, yellowish color. We've seen a few different species, at least in the last year, and they're sitting there and their heads are kind of moving around. You're like, whoa, you're kind of spastic. And then they're moving their heads around so they can encounter their prey. Then bang, they hit one of these aphids. You put it under the microscope, you can actually see they almost have like a knife-like mouth part that is just like piercing into the aphid back and forth, just stabbing them over and over again. And they kind of drink out the body of the aphid and then leave a husk behind. And then there they go again. Their heads are flapping around looking for another aphid. And then boom, starts all over again. Put them under the microscope. See those knives in action.
Very cool. Very cool. Okay, so I guess we should really be on the lookout then for certain beetles and flies then too, especially if they are in the beneficial category, if they are the heroes.
That's right, yeah. And so I've heard anecdotal reports of things like lady beetles being able to control those populations of aphids. It hasn't happened in any of my research fields, but we get the beneficial insects in there, and sure they're eating them, but man, those pea aphids are prolific because they are all female, and they just lay offspring that in 7 days start dropping their own offspring that are feeding on the plants. So you really have to weigh the beneficials with what's happening in your field. And so that's where those economic thresholds really come in handy and are needed.
I was just going to ask you, is that what makes the pea aphid so prolific? Is the fact that that's that 7-day cycle and there's so many are female, they're just able to replicate so fast?
That's right. Yeah. So if you think back to your math classes, you've got an exponential population buildup of pea aphids because of that.
Okay, so when we're talking about the beneficial beetles and flies, how do we encourage the population to give ourselves a bit of a free chance of control, so to speak?
Oh, that's a great idea. That's kind of $1 million question there. So in terms of the flies, I think a lot of these are migratory. So you never really know when they're going to show up or if they're going to show up. So for example, when we were looking in the cereal aphid system, we didn't see them for a few years. And so they didn't make our list of beneficial insects. And then we started seeing them later on. So, things like lady beetles, though, they overwinter as adults. And so overwintering habitat for them are kind of long grasses and margins of fields. So just leaving those areas for them to overwinter in. Other things like parasitic wasps that are coming in and stinging those aphids. I didn't put those on the list because I usually talk about the parasitic wasps attacking aphids, but giving them food sources, like they want to feed on nectar. And, if you're in a flowering crop, you're good to go. Your lentils, your faba bean, your peas, they've all got flowers and they're feeding nectar to these insects. So that's one way that it brings them into the crop. Even these hoverflies, the adults are in there drinking nectar as well.
So Dr. Wist, what should farmers know about beetles and flies when they go to control pea aphids in their lentils?
So they should know, first of all, what they've got. So if you see these little slug-like things, you've probably got the offspring of those hoverflies, also called syrphid flies or flower flies. If you see them flying around, you're like, hey, those look like little wasps. Maybe not. Maybe not. They're just feeding on the nectar. They're laying eggs in my crop. So just have a close look at those beneficial insects. Know what they are. Go to your field guides. We've got a lot of good field guides out there that have great pictures of these beneficial insects. So make yourself aware of what they are. And sometimes you have to make those hard calls. And if you have beneficial insects in there, but there's just not enough of them to control the pea aphids, know that at flowering, that's probably your most dangerous stage. So if your crop gets stressed out really badly by the pea aphids, we've had this in fava bean where you just get no yield because they drop their flowers when they get too stressed out. So Flowering seems to be, and this was also in the earlier research on the field peas, was your thresholds are lower at flowering compared to after flowering. So once your seeds are filled, then there's a lot less chance for damage. So there's staging issues too when you're looking at the pea aphids. And so be very careful around flowering stage for any insects that are in your field.
Great stuff. Dr. Wist, thanks so much for joining us here for the Pest Predator Podcast. Awesome information. Thank you so much. The energy you bring all the time when we chat. Really appreciate it.
Well, thanks for having me. I appreciate it, Shaun.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Pest Predator Podcast. It's brought to you by Field Heroes, powered by the Western Grains Research Foundation. Visit fieldheroes.ca to learn how beneficial insects can benefit your farm.